This is Mae Brussell. This is tape number 859, May the 23rd, 1988. As we get closer to the November elections, you might have noticed that I have spent no time at all on the presidential candidates. I'm not interested in any of them who are running, even when it narrows down to two. And the way I vote is usually, it has always been for the Democratic Party, because the Democrats would pick better justices for the Supreme Court than the Republicans. And outside of that, I can see very little difference. We had our coup d'etat November 22nd, 1963, and the players in that scene are visible almost every single day in the news, and I forget how often they are visible until the next morning when I wake up and see another item. An example of that is the story that I had with you last week on the tape about Financial News Network, and how Dr. Earl Bryan, the long friend of Edwin Meese, and Ronald Reagan made a killing off of the stock market crash, and had a reference to, in quotes, "It's a story FNN was born to cover. This is our version of the Kennedy assassination." And I shared with you a translation of what that means. And that reminded me that this is the anniversary of the birthday of John Kennedy. So I'm going to do this entire program on news items and articles and information that I have on the Kennedy assassination, because that really was the basis of where my research started. And the more I go back to that earlier work and the current news that relates to the murder, I realize this is where I should be spending my time and get started writing some books on the matter. Now, when you have a coup d'etat, the power control group takes over in every way that they can, and there were 3 articles this week, several this week, and one that I had in my files that I want to share with you about that power control group. May the 12th, 1988, Lou Cannon had a story in the Washington Post titled "Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford join a group to help the next president, whoever he is, avoid some pitfalls." In parentheses, I added "whoever he is." The Washington Post story is "Carter Ford joined group to help next president avoid some pitfalls. And the organization they formed is called the American Agenda. Now, Jimmy Carter was put in for 1 term by the Trilateral Commission, and Gerald Ford, you remember, was never elected president of anything. He was appointed by a crook, and then he couldn't win his own election, and he came right off the Warren Commission that Richard Nixon had put him on as a representative of the CIA to cover up the assassination. And that 1-term trilateral member, Jimmy Carter, handpicked by Zbigniew Brzezinski and David Rockefeller, was the interim until they could get Ronald Reagan as president, which I predicted many, many years ago. So, and also Jimmy Carter, of course, is linked to Ryosha Sasakawa. He took $17 million from him for his library. So that, plus the 912 dead at Jonestown, gives you a little bit of view of the Democratic president, former president, and then Gerald Ford. Now, they are starting what they call an unusual bipartisan group to assist the new president. And the coup really brought together what was the Democratic Party, Lyndon Johnson, who assisted in the cover-up of the murder of a democratically elected president, and with Gerald Ford helping him, and Alan Dulles and John J. McCloy on the Warren Commission. And then bipartisan shtick came together as soon as Kennedy was murdered, with the Democrats and Republicans having the same mind and how they would cover up this crime and literally control the world. Now, the article said that these great ex-presidents, Carter and Ford, and keep in mind just who they were and what they did, they are going to decide the 5 or 6 most serious issues likely to be faced by the next president, and when he's elected in November, they will put him in his hand and say, this is what you're supposed to direct yourself to. It won't be about Satanism and human sacrifice and cannibalism and chopping off babies' heads in front of children. These are the 6 issues that you are to address yourself to. And on the board, or the group handpicked for American Agenda, will be, number 1, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State; Brent Scowcroft, National Security Advisor after Kissinger was out, and now the main chairman of Kissinger Associates. And didn't Henry Gonzalez say in 1983 that the State Department was leased to Kissinger Associates? Also on the board will be Donald Rumsfeld, former Secretary of Defense, Michael Blumenthal, former Treasury Secretary, Edmund Muskie, formerly of the Tower Report that covered up the necessity to throw away the National Security Council entirely, Vernon Jordan, who was shot by Mr. Franklin, Joseph Franklin, who he's protected him and never spoke out about this mass murderer who's sitting in jail now, the same man who shot and paralyzed Larry Flint, Robert Strauss of the Democratic Party, a man who's called in all the time to advise Nancy Reagan, Director Stuart Eisenstadt, former U.S. attorney, he's in Washington, D.C., an attorney and advisor to Jimmy Carter, and the American Agenda already has started off the ground with a $500,000 grant from the Times-Mirror Corporation. Of course, that Times-Mirror is basically owned and was formed by the Chandler family, and they have Mr. Robert Murphy on the board. He's formerly of the CIA. So Los Angeles Times puts up $500,000 for Kissinger and Scowcroft to tell whoever is elected what the issues are that they will handle when they get in. Now, they said they will consult 75 specialists on the problem. Of course, these specialists will come from the National Security Council, from the National Security Agency, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the likes of Fritz Kramer. And the decisions of the most important policies will be handed to whoever wins, probably with a proclamation, follow these or your head will be blown off. So that's as much as I have to say about American Agenda. LA Times putting the money in, and of course Kissinger and Scowcroft being the kingpins of this whole operation. And of course, look at their past with Jerry Ford being the main news leaker and liar on the murder of John Kennedy and the covering up, and Jimmy Carter. Another article on the Power Control Group, April the 12th, 1988, last month, from the Washington Times. Powerful players get a global bank off the ground. And all this is happening while people are listening to Jesse Jackson saying we have to get more jobs, or Dukakis talking, making fun of the astrologer advising Nancy Reagan. That was the joke he got in California, speaking in Sacramento. All those petty little trivial things they're talking about. This is the second article about a power control group this past in the past couple weeks. Organizers will soon be announcing the final details for the long-delayed opening of the Credit International Bank, ambitious international finance bank. Plans are being prepared. It will be called Credit International. We have the American Agenda. Now, this is the money team, the Credit International, private banking service, and U.S. real estate financing for foreign investors to come and buy up our country, in addition to trade financing operations. Last September, they opened up with an initial capitalization of $45 million, by far the largest sum ever sought for a new bank in Washington, D.C. The head of the bank is going to be Mr. Richard Allen, former National Security Advisor, former partner with William Casey and Robert Vesco. The article from the Washington Times said this will be the largest initial capitalization fund ever for a Washington bank. Just last month, they raised $15 million to capitalize it. Credit International and its holding company, Credit International Bank, BANC Shares Limited, will have a director, and it will be headed by Chairman Richard V. Allen, which is nothing but a CIA bank that would replace probably Willard Zucker, a co-partner of theirs through the Iran-Contra affairs and going back to the Vesco days and the secret money in Swiss accounts. They have to shift gears sometimes, going into a different operation. So chairman now is Richard V. Allen, who now heads his own international consulting firm. He travels to the Far East, and other board members include Dr. Edwin Fulner, president and chief executive of Heritage Foundation. They set up the platform for Ronald Reagan. Washington-based think tank, Tom C. Kurologis, president of Timmons and Company, Washington government relations firm, Donald Hovde, H-O-V-D-E, chairman of J.E. Robert Company, and Charles Bennet, a Washington lawyer, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee. They have Mr. Strauss on the American Agenda, Charles Bennet of the Democratic Party with the Credit International Bank, and spelled two ways, so they have one overseas, probably the Netherlands Antilles, or one of the Swiss banks, or Luxembourg. They can put their other bank spelled with a C overseas, and it's very chic. Credit International will focus on private banking services, international trade financing, and they will have loan offices in Hong Kong and London. And the third focus of the bank will be to identify real estate financing opportunities and loan opportunities between 20 and 100 million. So they will be telling people fleeing from Hong Kong because China is going to take it over within a few years how to buy up America with their cash that's floating around. And the leaders of the Democratic Party are working with Richard Allen and the Heritage Foundation. And again, that's why I don't take the parties themselves seriously at all. Last week I shared with you just a little tidbit about Martin Anderson's new book on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and how Ronald Reagan and Henry Kissinger literally whittled it down so it would be more manageable, and the opponents of such things as sending arms to Iran or diverting money to the Contras wouldn't have probably passed if there were the full board. There is an article, it printed a while back, and I've referred to it other times, about when Reagan came into power and reactivated the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board with a P in front of it, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. This was from the Morning News in Dallas, October the 21st, 1981. And the article says, President Reagan reversed action taken 4 years ago by Jimmy Carter. He reestablished his Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and he added 5 Texans among its 19 members, among them Ann Armstrong, and she's the liaison to the committee that makes policy decisions for 20 years. She's on the board with Henry Kissinger, Fred Ikle, and Zbigniew Brzezinski. That's their long-range 20-year plan. The American agenda, of course, is what the next elected president will get in his hand, given by these experts in November. And, of course, the investments will come out of Richard Allen's firms. And this article in 1981 told who the the members of Texas were that Reagan put on the board. One was Ross Perot, who was very useful to the Reagan administration in trying to get the hostages and other surreptitious activities. The other was John Connally. Now, in 1981, Reagan was gung-ho about John Connally, but all of a sudden, Connally took a powder, disappeared out of Washington, went bankrupt in Texas. But in 1981, he had big political ambitions. The other one was Leon Jaworski, formerly from the Nuremberg trial, from the Kennedy assassination, the Warren Report, from covering up the Koreagate story, the Watergate story. Leon Jaworski was appointed by Ronald Reagan then to be on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And another person appointed by Reagan was Edward Bennett Williams. Now, Edward Bennett Williams had already been identified as the law office representing John Hinckley, also Robert Vesco and Richard Helms and Jimmy Hoffa, but he was on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and along with them in 1981 was placed Admiral Thomas Moore, also on the board of Western Goals, you remember, and still is probably, and that institution was putting a $100,000 computer, had it attached to the LAPD, and probably has it in 50 states or 150 states, but this one was identifiable. And there are other members of that board, Claire Luce, a very active person in the Vatican, the Knights of Malta, whose husband owned Time, Life, and Jerry Ford, and Leon Jaworski used Life magazine eloquently to display the lie that Lee Harvey Oswald was the alone assassin of John Kennedy. And another member on that board was Alfred Bloomingdale, who shortly afterwards was dying of cancer, and his mistress was exposing his sadomasochism. And while she was living with him, she was living with Bernie Cornfield, a partner of Mr. Zucker, and working with investment overseas, and with Robert Vesco and Richard Allen. So this Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board was stacked with people who had direct fingers into the assassination of John Kennedy and the cover-up. John Connally, of course, was in the car with Jack Kennedy. He was the governor of Texas that completely covered up the murder. He survived the attack. He may not have even known where it was going to take place, but he sure knew how to cover it up afterwards, starting with the destruction of the clothing that he had that would tell where the entry and exit fibers were, that would illustrate that Oswald didn't shoot them from the back, that the bullet holes went through the front of the clothing. And one more article on the Power Control Group this past week, May the 11th, 1988, investigative team set up by law firm. Now, the law firm to test and investigate corporations that may have their fingers into hanky-panky major crimes is the Washington office of the New York law firm of Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy. That's John J. McCloy of the Warren Commission, John J. McCloy, who designed the Pentagon, who released the top Nazis, who was High Commissioner of Germany, that worked closely with Reinhard Galen, von Galen. His name really was von Galen. And these people are sending up a investigative group, a private investigative group, to work with executives and directors of possible illegal acts done by their employees. Now, this is going to be a first of its kind, just like that first of its kind bank that Richard Allen's going to be part of, the first of its kind in the Washington area, headed by three Milbank Tweed's well-known partners. And incidentally, John J. McCloy is still alive. People wonder if he's alive. He's very much alive. Partners of this law office, we are going to use former Attorney General Elliot Richardson. Richardson, of course, was the attorney for Cyrus Hashemi and has been covering up a large part of the investment of Hashemi into Merrill Lynch. Merrill Lynch funding an operation for weapons, and Richardson was part of that. William E. Jackson and Thomas Puccio, former government prosecutor in the Abscam case. A number of U.S. companies have turned to special examination teams to investigate major internal legal problems, and in part, special investigating teams often enjoy more credibility. So the High Commissioner, these high lawyers going right from the Warren Commission, John J. McCloy, and of course, these names that were involved in the cover-up of the murder of John Kennedy, as I say, weave through our news all the time, and I think it's important to update those for you and just illustrate where those people are now as against what they were doing 25 years ago. The Washington Times article says the model for the service that they're forming, cited by Elliot Richardson, was the investigation and subsequent report prepared for the investment banking firm of E.F. Hutton in 1985 by former Carter administration Attorney General Griffin Bell, following federal allegations that employees in a number of Hutton offices were conducting a multi-million-dollar check-kiting scheme. Now, E.F. Hutton was not only involved in a check-kiting scheme, and they paid a $1 million penalty in Rhode Island last week for their investment of mafia drug money, but this same Mr. Thomas Puccio, who is now affiliated with John J. McCloy and this outfit, Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy, very carefully skirted the responsibility of Merrill Lynch and E.F. Hutton in putting the heroin money from New York City into Swiss banks, and some of it even going to Mr. Paul Waradal, who paid Mr. Salenke Bey Ali Ajah to shoot the Pope. So they call that a very successful investigation when it skirted the real issues. And then the article said Milbank partner John J. McCloy helped conduct a special internal investigation of Gulf Oil Corporation following charges of irregularities in the oil business. So what we have here are examples that have been in the newspaper just recently. And then to refresh your memory, in case you didn't remember, the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board with people like John Connally and Leon Jaworski, etc., that these special law firms are being set up in Washington to go into the hanky-panky of the major corporations who never get prosecuted, and banks are being set up by Richard Allen, whereby our country can be sold to foreign investors, and he's working with the Democratic Party, the Republican, the Heritage Foundation, etc. And then this special agenda where the new president, whoever he is, gets a package put in his hand and says, well, this is what you are to deal with. These are the 6 issues you will deal with. And then the blinders are put on so he can't look the other way, and he says, well, I'm busy with this agenda. Now, there's some of you that live on the West Coast in San Francisco area that get this tape. I want to tell you, in case you didn't see it in the Chronicle, that the play Kennedy's Children opened up there. It got good reviews in the Chronicle, and it is playing at a theater called Lyrika, Lyrika Productions, at the Climate, CLIMAT Theater, 252 9th Street, and it will be playing through next Friday, through Saturday, May 28th. And so I recommend it. A lot of you will get this tape and maybe have a chance a day or two to make plans to go see it. Kennedy's Children is a brilliant play written by Robert Patrick in 1975, examining 4 kinds of people that were affected by the Kennedy assassination and what it did to them. And there are 4 people who literally give monologues but interweave without, they don't relate to each other but tell you their own particular tragedy. And there's Wanda, the black lady who misses Kennedy so much and talks about the civil rights advances that were going to take place, and Carla, who's the prototype of Marilyn Monroe at the period, and what the period was meaning and doing to her. Then there was Sparger, an actor and a civil rights activist who's burned out by the hypocrisy and greed of what happened from the 60s of Kennedy until 75 when this play was written. And then there's the Vietnam veteran, Mark, who is disillusioned, who lost his innocence, went into drugs, and talks about the murders he did. Maybe if you've never read this play, you might send for it or go to a bookstore and see if you can buy it. Those of you in the Bay Area can get it. Now, as I say, I'm going to take things that I've had in my files and things that are in the news and share them with you, and some very shocking things about the Kennedy assassination and new material that I had here and didn't even realize. I passed over it, didn't see what I was seeing at the time, see it better now. It's been 23, 24 years since I read certain things I'm going to share with you today that are so important, and it excites me when I get out the Warren Commission hearings. A lot of people may wonder, how could she spend 9 years reading 26 volumes of exhibits and testimony? But truthfully, there wasn't one single time period that was boring for me. And even when I was doing it, I have to say that when I started, I was married, raising 5 children. The youngest was 2 years old. I had never read a mystery book, no background investigative work. I missed so many clues in the 26 volumes that now I'm ready to go back again and read all of them. Forget the Iran-Contra, go back to where the problem started, and I want to share some of that with you right now. There was one article written in Review of the News. That's a publication put out by John Reese, an article by Frank Capel, and this is what was in this Review of the News. The authors of the 1971 German Accords, which approved the concept of 2 Germanys, accepted the Berlin Wall at the time, and arranged the admission of the Red-occupied Germany, East Germany, to the United Nations. The people that did this, among others, were Helmut Sonnenfeld, and Sonnenfeld is an active member now in Kissinger Associates. James Sutherland was another person that went along with this, and Henry Kissinger. And Sutherland was selected by Henry Kissinger to be the boss of the U.S., the entire United States Foreign Service. Then there's the case of Boris H. Klossen, Klosson, another possible security risk, who was appointed on Henry Kissinger's recommendation to become a top-ranking political intelligence officer at the U.S. negotiating team assigned to strategic arms limitation talks. Those were the SALT talks in those early days, and with Ronald Reagan going to meet in the Soviet Union, all the discussion of weapons. This goes back to the SALT talks earlier in a time period of 1971 when Henry Kissinger appointed as his top person at the SALT talks for him Boris Klossen. Boris Klossen, on July 11th, 1961, that's quite a while back, made it possible for Lee Harvey Oswald to return with his communist bride to the United States from the Soviet Union. That paved the way for Oswald, according to Frank Capel. He loves to say Oswald killed Kennedy, but it paved the way for Oswald to be the patsy for the murder of President John Kennedy. On behalf of the ambassador, Klossen, the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, who was Walter Stessel at the time, later became the High Commissioner, ambassador also to Poland. Walter Stessel, my old next-door neighbor on Walden Drive, lived right next door to me when we went through high school and college. He was the ambassador to the Soviet Union. Klossen signed a statement indicating that Oswald was disillusioned with the Soviet Union. He should be permitted to return to our country. Boris Klossen authorized the money to finance the trip for Comrade Oswald and his wife. Now, Henry Kissinger worked with Boris Klossen at the time, and Klossen gave the money. Now, I'm going to read to you from the Warren Commission hearings. When Lee is ready to come home, he writes to his mother, "Go to the International Rescue Committee and get the money for our coming home, and they will arrange it. Don't you put up your own money." The International Rescue Committee was formed in 1946 for political purposes for emigres who from the far right for the Cold War, and it was headed by Leo Cherne, C-H-E-R-N-E, who is still on Ronald Reagan's President's Intelligence Foreign Advisory Board, and at the time was Spas Reagan. That organization sent the money to Lee and Marina Oswald to come home, and the man who worked with Oswald was Boris Klossen, who was appointed this high job on Kissinger's recommendation to political intelligence officer for the U.S. negotiating team. So Klossen wrote the letter on behalf of Oswald. He was assigned to the United States Embassy in Moscow, and he was the instigator of the money, and Henry Kissinger selected Klossen for the SALT team and had access to the details of the money by which Lee and Marina Oswald came to the United States. Remember that name, and I'll do more on that later, but this is another link of Henry Kissinger rewarding and promoting a person who worked out of the Russian embassy and provided the means for Lee and Marina Oswald to come to the United States, and they had as much information they needed about them if they wanted to hold up the money. Now, in the hearings, in the Warren Commission hearings, there are sections on the white Russian community, and of course I outlined these for years, and I want to describe some of the testimony of Paul Raigorodsky, a wealthy oil man who is testifying in Volume 9 of the Warren Commission hearings about the social milieu that Marina and Lee entered into after Henry Kissinger's friend arranged the money for them to come home. And some of the questions are silly. The person asking the questions about the white Russian community is Albert Jenner, the attorney at the same time for Henry Crown and General Dynamics. As soon as Kennedy was killed, the F-111, the F-16, and the General Dynamics Corporation became a multinational profiteer of the Vietnam Southeast Asian War. Jenner was the attorney for Henry Crown as well as on the Warren Commission, and so he's the one asking the questions. He said, will you be good enough, Mr. Raigorodsky, to tell me first, in general, if there's a usual pattern of somebody coming here to the United States from Russia? How do they become acquainted in this community of Russian descent? I have in mind the connection of Oswalds, trying to find the Oswalds. What would be the common manner of fashion that the Oswalds became acquainted? What were your interests in people like them? And Raigorodsky said, there are methods of immigration into the communities in Dallas of the Russians I'm talking about. One is friendship, acquaintanceship, somewhere in Europe or China or somewhere else, different Russians, and, of course, the Order of the Tolstoy Foundation, which was a CIA foundation. Raigorodsky said the Tolstoy Foundation was started by Miss Tolstoy. She came to the United States, organized the foundation to take care of Russian refugees throughout the world, wherever they may be. They process them, which means they know all about them. They come into here through their own organization or different organizations, and then there's a church organization, and you go to the Tolstoy Foundation, and they place the Russians in this country. This is page 5 of volume 9. I'm on the board of directors of the Tolstoy Foundation, also in foreign countries. Now, anybody who comes to the Tolstoy Foundation, you know right off the bat that they've been checked and rechecked and double-checked, and here's Spas Reagan, and a man from the International Rescue Committee that works with the Tolstoy Foundation, and Lee Oswald is writing for the Soviet Union to his mother to tell her to go there for their money. I'm on the board of directors of Tolstoy, he says. Now, anybody who comes is checked. There's no question about it. I mean, that's the number one stamp. And Jenner says that's the number one stamp of approval of your genuineness of approval, Raigorodsky said. In fact, the U.S. government recognized that and has been aware of the Tolstoy Foundation. They gave as much as $400,000 a year. That's from the CIA subsidy for this work, and other Russians come here. And so he's telling what a great organization this Tolstoy Foundation is. And Raigorodsky says in Houston we have a group of people that meet them, a small group of Russians. They have the approval of the Tolstoy Foundation. And then he said they come and get into place. And then he said, I would like to go off the record. And before Earl Warren and Gerald Ford and John J. McCloy and Alan Dulles, Raigorodsky goes off the record for a moment and then begins to tell about the churches in Houston and Dallas that the aristocracy go through as against the other people, and that Marina Oswald went immediately into the very elite church of the old guard, who fled the Bolsheviks, and she was embraced into the Church of the White Russians in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He goes into the difference between St. Seraphim in Dallas, people who escaped the communist regime, and St. Nicholas, the Church of the old guard. and the difference between the two churches and how Marina Oswald gets into the most elite group of people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I'll take about, 1 second break. We'll just flip this tape over and continue with the story of the Oswalds. This is Mae Brussell, and it is side 2 of tape 859, May the 23rd, 1988. Now, I'm going to go back to the Russian aristocracy and the social milieu that the Oswalds came from, because there was an article just a week or so ago in the newspaper about a reunion of Russian nobility in New York City. And I'm going back to the testimony of the Old Guard Church, and I also want to explain some of the linkage of how the Old Guard got here from the book of Kim Philby called My Silent War that I referred to last week with the passing of Kim Philby. But for the second half of this tape, I want to just get into sections of the Warren Commission hearing that are pertinent to today. The movie Manchurian Candidate has come out. It's playing in town now. I'm going to see it next Sunday. And there was a picture of Frank Sinatra in the Carmel Pinecone holding the card, the playing card, the Queen of Diamonds. And it's a symbol of a form of hypnotic operation in order to be triggered to kill the President of the United States. And I remembered in the early hearings and material I had about Lee Harvey Oswald with the Queen of Spades. And I wanted to reread that and get out the parallels. And in the process of looking for that in Volume 1, I came across some amazing material that some I remembered and some I had passed over, but I started outlining this material 24 years ago. And my concept of fascism and Nazism developed, but I want to share with you some pages of the commission hearings, just as they are now, looking back to what was printed in 1964 and was given as testimony in 1964. Now, the Warren Commission volumes, there's 26 volumes, volume 1 to 5 through 15 are witness testimony. And volume 16 to 26 are exhibits that apply to what the witnesses are saying in the other part, but they're not printed together. So when somebody is talking, you don't know what they're seeing. You have to hold the two side by side as they talk to see what they're talking about. And starting with volume 1 on page 103, there's an afternoon session of the Warren Commission, and Earl Warren is talking, and they're going through exhibits that Marina Oswald had, exhibits 30 through 65, and they simply give them numbers. So they'll say number 30 is a letter from Marina's former fiancé. 32 is the Zeigers, who are friends. Number 33 is from Alexander Zeiger, and it doesn't say that he came from Argentina and ran the Minsk radio factory, and 46 is from Aunt Valia, and 47 is Uncle Tolia, and I'll do more about that with you later. But they just run down these names. This is Valia, this is Julia, this is Tolia. So exhibit number 53, they say 52, is a letter received by Marina when she was in the hospital when June was born in 1961. So you can just look at that and open it up and see what in the other volume. Number 53 is Lee Harvey Oswald's writing. Number 54 is a letter from a friend, La Lilia. Number 55 is a letter from Oswald to Marina while she was in Kharkov. Okay, now that's the way it says. Number 56 is the same. Number 57 is Aunt Valia. So going back to number 53, all the Warren Commission says is number 53 is Lee Harvey Oswald's writing. And when you go to volume 16 and you look up what they're referring to, exhibit number 53, this is what it says, and this is what I was looking for. Translator's note, the exhibit. The following fragment may be an attempt to reproduce from memory the text of an aria from an opera by Tchaikovsky, The Queen of Spades. Now, I have 3 books on operas, and I looked at them this weekend. I can't find that opera, Queen of Spades of Tchaikovsky, listed. I have to go to the Monterey Library this week, or Carmel Library, and look that up. The Warren Commission says the fragment contains numerous errors, omissions, and distortions. In a translation, the omissions were marked with long lines broken, and unintelligible words distorted beyond recognition, were marked with a straight line. So we are deprived of what was written, just like Sirhan's diary or Artie Bremer's diary or whatever. This is what Oswald had, exhibit number 53, which is simply described in the most passing, nonchalant way as something, it's a Lee Harvey Oswald's writing. It's called Queen of Spades. And this is what is written. I love you immeasurably. I cannot imagine life without you. I am ready right now to perform the most heroic deed of unprecedented prowess for your sake. I do not wish to restrain your heart's freedom in any way. I'm ready to conceal my feelings to please you. Broken lines. I am ready to do anything for your sake. Underline. I am willing, parenthesis, not only to be your husband, but a servant. Indifferent, then there's broken lines. I would like to be your friend and keep on being one for always. But I clearly see now where, broken lines, but what is the matter with me? How little you trust me? How feeling? Straight line. How remote? Oh, I am tormented with this. Broken lines, long line of them. To you, my soul, I am sad with your sadness. I weep with your tears. I am tormented with this passionately to you, all my soul. Repeat, question mark, oh, my dear, I love you. Long lines. Now, the thing that was of interest here is he said, I am now to perform a heroic deed of unprecedented prowess for your sake. And a man named Warren Carroll of the CIA, who wrote the program's Lifeline for H.L. Hunt, had essays on heroism that were in the seat of Jack Ruby's car, and Ruby had been brainwashed to say, be a hero once in your lifetime and do this great thing. And here Oswald is writing, I'm ready to perform a heroic deed, and I do not wish to restrain your freedom. In August of 1963 in New Orleans, Lee Harvey Oswald applied for a new passport because their passport was, I guess, joint when they came over from Russia in June of 62, and this time he got a single passport and left her out of it. And he got it in 24 hours. He applied in New Orleans and had a new passport in 24 hours after having been repatriated in Russia. And also among these letters are letters from the mother of Marina Oswald's fiancé. And remember, the Warren Commission says fiancé, and Marina's attorney said yes, she had been engaged to somebody else. And they had met. The Oswalds went to a meeting one evening, met at the meeting. It was a dance, a political dance meeting or whatever, not a real dance or a real political meeting. A social group of young people where they went to the home of a person or persons who had just returned from the United States who were never identified. They speak about Marina's other fiancé. They had separate passports. There were two Alex. In Russia, he was known as Alec, A-L-E-C-K. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there was another A-L-E-C-K, and the possibility of doubles this duplicate name. And soon these two Alex would be operating with the same people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So when I saw the Monterey Herald picture of Frank Sinatra, because that movie has been held up by Frank Sinatra, and I'll do more about him, and you know his role introducing Judith Exner to John Kennedy while he was friends with Sam Giancana and John Rosselli. The Monterey Herald, the Carmel Pinecone, has a picture of him pondering the Queen of Diamonds. Korean War veteran and Army Intelligence Major Ben Marco, which is Frank Sinatra, ponders the mysterious importance in the Queen of Diamonds in the chilling classic, The Manchurian Candidate. And here is Lee Harvey Oswald with, among their possessions, this Act 2, Queen of Spades. I love you now. I am ready right now to perform a heroic deeds, unprecedented prowess. Now, the next exhibit, which follows shortly afterwards, at Exhibit 53, the Warren Commission is showing some more exhibits. Exhibit number 1 purports to be answers to a questionnaire they filled out when they were coming to this country. 101 is a copy of a page printed in English. And then they come to an Exhibit 102, and it's a photograph of some pages handwritten in English that are Lee Harvey Oswald's handwriting. And Mr. Thorne, Marina's attorney, says Exhibit 102 are copies, 2 pages, written in English. Mrs. Oswald says that's Lee's writing. I don't know what it is. And Lee Rankin, the chief attorney for the Warren Commission, says we offer an exhibit in evidence, Exhibit 102, and Earl Warren says that may be admitted. And, of course, Gerald Ford is there, as I say, and John J. McCloy and so forth. So they admit 102, and then they go on to exhibit 103, which is 2 pages of his writing in English, and then 104 and 105. And when they get to 105, they said, well, wait a minute, we better go back to 102. I call your particular attention, Mr. Lee Rankin said. They're up to exhibit 105. And he said, let's go back to 102 first, because this is a draft of a proposed speech. Now, Marina says she doesn't know what it is, and it's supposed to be a speech. And so they put in the Warren Commission Volume 1 what the speech is, and the attorney says, this indicates some of his thinking. And then Earl Warren again says, we'll now take a short break. That's the greatest thing they did, was to go off the record when things were hot. So they admitted into evidence 102, 2 pages of his handwriting in English, 103, 104, then 105. And this is very important, because they say, well, let's go back to 102. I better call your attention. And it indicates his thinking, and then they go off the record. And this is what Oswald wrote. There's a photocopy of it. And this, again, is in Volume 16, page 441. Commission Exhibit 102. And they had jumped over it once and passed it and decided they better put it in. He said, Americans are apt to scoff at the idea that a military coup in the United States, as so often happens in Latin American countries, could ever replace our government. But that is an idea that has grounds for consideration. Which military organization has the potentiality of executing such action? Is it the Army, with its many constripes for its unwieldy size and its scores of bases scattered around the world? Is it the case of General Walker, that shows that the Army, at least, is not fertile enough ground for a far right-wing regime to go a very long way? Now, he mentions General Walker in this speech, part of the material that was printed in the Soviet Union, and when Lee comes home in 1962, June of 62 from the Soviet Union, the men, Volkmar Schmidt, Larry Schmidt, are setting up their organization with Robert Morris in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, coming from Munich, Germany, to work with General Walker. And Lee Harvey Oswald was taken by Michael Paine to see General Walker just weeks before the assassination. He's saying, could Walker do the coup? He said, that's not fertile enough ground for a far-right regime to go, for the same reasons of the size and disposition that the Navy or Air Force would be more or less disregarded. Which service, then, can qualify to launch a coup in the United States, a right-wing coup? Small size, a permanent hard corps of officers, and few bases is necessary. Only one outfit fits the description. That is the U.S. Marine Corps that Oswald was in. It is right-wing, infiltrated organization of dire potential consequences to the freedom of the United States. I agree with former President Truman when he said the Marine Corps should be abolished. My second reason is that undemocratic, country-wide institution known as segregation. It is, I think, the action of the active segregationist minority and the great body of indifferent people in the South who do the United States more harm in the eyes of the world's people. Now, he goes in about the Negro and the segregation, and he lived in the South, and Kennedy had put General Walker into a mental hospital at the time of registering blacks in Mississippi. And when you read what Oswald has called a speech, it doesn't say where, and you compare it to the Lee Harvey Oswald diary that was on the cover of Life magazine, there's no comparison in spelling or thinking. But what he's talking about is that there's going to be a coup in the United States, that there is hatred, racial hatred, and so forth. And the Warren Commission passes it off as this is something Oswald wrote, and he continues, nowadays there are right-wing groups to know enough to recognize them and guard against their corrosive effects. And he goes on about the possibility of a right-wing coup in the United States. And I won't read the entire 4 paragraphs about the liberal conscience and the American way, but to say that when the subject came up, they said, here's page 102 in his writing. Okay, let's go to 3 and 4 and 5. And then they said, well, wait a minute, we better go back and read, because he says the Americans will scoff at the idea that there will be a military coup, which happens in Latin American countries. And of course, his mentor in Minsk was Mr. Alexander Zeiger from Argentina. that could replace our government, which organization would it be? Walker isn't strong enough yet. The Army isn't strong enough, but a small group like the U.S. Marine Corps, which is a right-wing infiltrated organization, could do it. And, of course, if you read Galen's Spy of the Century, and I'll share that with you in a moment, the Galen operation set up the United States Marine Corps for a operation that would do exactly what Oswald was saying, and he was in that Marine Corps. Now, after they go back to this exhibit, and Mr. Rankin reads what Oswald said and concludes with the sentence that I agree with former President Truman when he said the Marine Corps should be abolished, and says this indicates some of his thinking. Earl Warren then says, we will take a short break. And you have to visualize this. If you can't, I will photocopy and send you pages of this. If you send me, just to save time, a self-addressed stamped envelope, maybe you would like these references, or I'll put them in a book. I really have to start writing a book on the subject, because then the commission will be in order. They come back, they take a recess after the talk of the coup. And then Mr. Thorne says, this is Exhibit 106 for identification. It's a notebook. These are poems. Marina Oswald says, these are poems, handwritten poems in Russian. How did you happen to write that, Mrs. Oswald? I simply like verses. I didn't have a book of poems, and I made a copy. Now, she was a trained medical technician in the Soviet Union, and books are available to people in the Soviet Union. She didn't have a book of poems, and I'm going to analyze that poem after I see the movie Manchurian Candidate, not share it with you now. But she said, I like the poem, and so I put it, and it's several pages, into the exhibit, and it was marked Commission Exhibit 106. And then the next exhibit, Mr. Thorne, her attorney, says, is a small piece of cardboard written with Russian that has Lee's pass to the radio factory in Minsk. Now, after her poem in Exhibit 106, which they share with you, they say, we will mark that Commission Exhibit 106 and reserve it in evidence. I offer in evidence 106, and then we go on to 107. And what is in this, written in the book of Marina Oswald on page 474 of the Warren Commission Hearings, Volume 16, is writing on the back cover of Marina Oswald's notebook, Schicklgruber, Adolf Hitler, Schicklgruber. That was his name, Adolf H. Schicklgruber. And Marina Oswald, who has no political writings in any of the 26 volumes, who is totally apolitical, who works at the Minsk radio, her lover, the man she met in 1 week, they were married 3 weeks later, they had 2 dates and were married and met at the home that first night with people that had come from the United States. And he's writing about General Walker and a coup d'etat in this country. The writing on the backside of her cover, written in her language, is Adolf Hitler, Schicklgruber. And the thing that so amazed me when I saw this is that the first time I saw it, it didn't even make connections. I remember the Queen of Spades, but truthfully, raising 5 kids and busy reading this in the afternoon and evening, this was starting in September of 1964 when the commission hearings came. I'm into Marina Oswald, and they're passing over Exhibit 106. We're not very far along. They've got 34,000 exhibits, and here is Mr. Schicklgruber, Adolf Hitler. There aren't many people who know his name, but now I'm more convinced than ever that the Alexander Zeiger family knew Schicklgruber very well. As a matter of fact, in my article in Rebel on the Nazis and the JFK assassination, if you read it, and if you don't have it, write to me and I'll send it to you subscribers. I mentioned that while the Warren Commission was doing their research, a gentleman, Isaac Don Levine, was arranging for the Zeiger family to return to Argentina. The Warren Commission was arranging for Oswald's boss, the one who introduced the Marina, to go back to Argentina even before the Warren Report is published. What fingers did we have with Mr. Stessel, our ambassador, who later was Deputy Secretary of Defense under Alexander Haig? In the Reagan administration, we were arranging the Zeigers' return to Argentina, which would be a location, in fact, identified just a year ago, Mendoza, Argentina, of Mr. Schicklgruber himself, and in the diary of Marina. And as I say, go through 34,000 exhibits, 26 volumes, you'll never find anything political, left, right, or middle. And there is the name Adolf H. Schicklgruber inside of her book. And then to get some more to the commission hearings, On page 116, we jump now from 106 to another exhibit called 131. They're running down the line, same formality. Here's exhibit 131. This is a one-sheet document written in Russian. Why did you have these copies? And Mrs. Oswald said they were needed for regularizing the documents in connection with our trip abroad. And why was the date written from July 14th to July 19th? You changed it. She said the date was changed because when the paper was issued, it was written wrong the first time. So they talked about 131. They said, now we're going to exhibit 132. This is a 2-page, 8-page letter with an envelope. It's written in Russian. She said the envelope is from Sobolev, and the letter is from Golovich, a friend of theirs. Maybe didn't pronounce that right. I kept them together. The envelope is from one person. The letter is from another. There's a reference in the last paragraph of that letter. Mrs. Oswald, where it says, by the way, Marina, try to explain to Paul the basic idea of Pagadolzin's play called A Man with a Rifle that is contained in these words. Do you know what that meant? It says, now we do not have to fear a man with a rifle. So we have this man going ready to be a hero, a great hero in his time written. We have a gentleman who, out of the Minsk Radio Factory, his wife is writing about Mr. Schicklgruber and Adolf Hitler, and he's writing this composite on a coup is going to take place in the United States that will be run by the Marines. And not only were the Marines formed in North Carolina by Hitler's top agents in guerrilla and terrorism and mass murder, but this is the location of a plan to shoot General Walker that Mr. Frankerberry wrote to me about, that I've had on World Watchers a long time ago. They practiced the shooting. Walker wasn't shot, but it was important to the whole cover story of the Kennedy assassination, and that came out of North Carolina. So they say to her, well, what is this? And does the word rifle scare you? She says, or she asked the commission, this is only the word rifle. Does it scare you? It's quite harmless. This is Peter Gregory, Paul. He's studying Russian, and he had to make a report at the Institute about Pagadolzin's play, Man with a Rifle. This is a play about the revolution in Russia, and there's a film. I helped him with it. Mr. Rankin, you're satisfied this had nothing to do with the assassination? And she says, yes. And he said, now we'll go on to exhibit 133. So her friend in Dallas-Fort Worth area, Paul Gregory, was learning Russian from her. He was high up in the intelligence field, the petroleum field, and his father was with Marina as soon as John Kennedy was assassinated and closely associated with her. And they're talking about a play, not the Queen of Spades by Tchaikovsky now, but the Man with the Rifle. And so that exhibit of what she had, exhibit 132, is then put into volume 16. And they say, now we'll go to volume 133. And there are the pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald with the rifle. So you get the association of a premeditated. And what she's talking about in the one exhibit is something written in Minsk. And it says, this is volume 16, going back to the exhibits. And it's exhibit 132. Page 507. Now, I promised this letter to send you Zana's address. Here's her address, Leningrad, and it gives the address of Zana Shishkova. By the way, Marina, try to explain to Paul, your friend Paul, the basic idea of Pogadin's play, Man with a Rifle, that's contained in these words, in quotes. Now we do not have to fear a man with a rifle. This, as doctors say, is a quintessence. Thank you for sending several numbers of America. They will come soon, Amerika. I will send them to you soon. The magazine America, you will get here. But you know, America, just as the magazine Soviet Union, are not ordinary weekly magazines. Now, I was not aware in this country that we had a magazine in this time period of 1962. The Oswalds came to this country in June 62, and this letter is written from the Soviet Union in October 62, referring to the Man with the Rifle. And if Zeiger and those people arranged the meeting with Marina and all this cockamamie that's going on, they also were writing about, explain to your friend about the Man with the Rifle. And then they're referring to a magazine, America, which we think of as fascist America with a K. And he said, we don't get that magazine in the Soviet Union. They're not ordinary weekly magazines. From the beginning, these magazines are prepared for abroad for export. I would prefer to get from you technical ones of the type of our magazines. Then he says, knowledge is power, is one of the he wants. He doesn't say it's a magazine. I would prefer to get from you the technical ones of the type of our magazines. Quotes, knowledge is power, end quotes, technology for youth, end quotes, and radio technical ones and the ordinary weekly magazines of life, of the life type. And he has that in capital letters. And, of course, Life magazine first published the Lee Harvey Oswald Man with the Rifle, which is Exhibit 133, which was on the cover of Life immediately, put there by Henry Luce, the husband of Claire Luce of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Reagan put her on. But he's asking for some magazines, Knowledge is Power, and send me ordinary weekly magazines of the Life type. And Life is written in great big capital letters with the quotes, and Life printed Man with a Rifle, that picture, which, as I say, follows this Exhibit 133, the man at the fence, Oswald, and Life magazine also printed the Lee Harvey Oswald diary that was leaked to Life by Commission member Jerry Ford, who became president, appointed by Richard Nixon, again, who put him on the Warren Commission, and Life was instrumental in passing along the big lie, the visual image. So when you get to Volume 16, page 510, there is Commission Exhibit 133, A, B, and 4, Lee Harvey Oswald, the man with the rifle. Now, all of this is more than fascinating. I think putting it together and adding it up after all these years where she's writing the name Adolf Hitler into her book, the Zeigers from Argentina, his talking this Queen of Spades diatribe about being a hero, the correspondence with their friends about the man with the rifle, nothing to fear about the man with the rifle, and Oswald saying that there's going to be a coup d'etat in the United States that will come out of the Marine Corps with the background of the Marines formed by Reinhard von Galen, and Kim Philby refers to him as von Galen. The von was taken off because it sounded too German. It's like when George de Mohrenschildt described his brother, and I'll share some more of that with you, and their Nazi connections. Dmitri is Dmitri von de Mohrenschildt, but it sounded too German-like, so George prefers just plain George de Mohrenschildt. Then you won't know where he comes from. So going back to the early hearings and exhibits and volumes, and they're really worn threadbare. I held them and read them so much, and it's very exciting for me to go back now and reread what they passed over and to see it in a different light. It's sort of like a wine maturing, you know. I've had 23, 24 years to see something different. What I thought I was looking for was evidence that Lee and Marina Oswald were spies of the intelligence community of the United States. Schicklgruber and Hitler, what it was so far removed, not that it was removed from my mind, because when the Warren Commission hearings came, and I've explained it before, I went to Volume 9, just fingering them, and there was this long explanation of the background of George de Mohrenschildt and his close friends and relatives that were Nazis, and his being a suspect as a Nazi criminal during World War II and being followed from New York to Corpus Christi by the FBI as a suspect of a Nazi. So when I started with Volume 1, Nazi came to my mind, yes, because I had peeked at Volume 9, but I sure passed over Schicklgruber, and I passed over, I have to admit it, and I say this for you people, and all of you are younger than me. There's no researcher probably. There's a few older than me, but there aren't many around, or as active as I am. And you start new and you don't know how to start. You start the best you can. Will you miss things? Of course you miss things. Will you pick up a lot? Yes, you may pick up things that we didn't see, that I didn't see. If you got Volume 1, you might have called me and said, did you see Schicklgruber's name in the testimony and the exhibits? And they all referred as just 106, not the fact that it's Hitler. And Alan Dulles played such a key role in bringing the Nazis through Heinrich Himmler and SS Karl Wolff into the world, out of the Nazi experience of World War II into South America. Alan Dulles working with the OSS and forming the CIA, and John J. McCloy so active with the Nazis in arming Hitler, recognizing Hitler, being the attorney for I.G. Farben, and releasing the top Nazis out of jail. They sat in it when these exhibits were presented and knew Schicklgruber's name and didn't even bring to breath a subject about what it was at all that they were seeing, or maybe they just took by the number and admitted as evidence, and, well, they knew what was going on, of course. And next week, I will update a lot of the news, go into some more about Edwin Mason Inslaw. I want to get back to that. But I believe I should continue sharing with you names and incidences that pertain to the murder of John Kennedy and how they are in the news, just like they were in the Barron's article about Dr. Bryan and Ed Meese and Bryan's buying the UPI, having the money based upon a stock market crash, those parallels, and weave the Kennedy assassination, which was 25 years ago, into where these people are now today and what they are doing. My time is up now. I'll be back with you next week and continue along these lines and whatever there is in the news to share with you.